Tonight we'll be starting with Esbats. And one of the things that, just for those who may be new to these sermons and stuff, collaborative. You know, if you have things to say, just raise your hand. I'm sure you can figure it out in Zoom. We've been doing this for years at this point, so if you can figure that out, that's awesome. And I'll try and get to you, or else I will just steamroll straight through. But yeah, I do encourage questions and comments and that kind of thing. And I'll do my best to get to you. If you need anything, let me know. Okay, so, and I read these notes every single time. It's like I don't even have it memorized yet. But my name is Andrew Downing. I am part of the Church of Witchcraft, and my role in that is the Hierophant. Basically, I just make sure things stay on the rails and don't get too sideways for everybody. I particularly work with celestial witchcraft, so it has to do a lot more with astrology. It has to do with planetary bodies. I do a lot of solar stuff, lunar stuff, along with the solstice and equinox. Which, by the way, is an important aspect of today. Tomorrow, actually, this is Midsummer Eve. Ooh, wait, we should watch that.
I'm watching it on Thursday.
All right. For those who don't know, there's a guest over here to my left. So I am not just talking to space. I do still have most of my novels. But Celestial Witchcraft focuses on those aspects. And also, thanks to anybody who's watching this in the future on whatever platform. Right now, it's on YouTube. So in the future, I don't know where it might be, but thanks for watching. And we appreciate you taking the time out of your life for that. So as I had said, we'll be talking about Esbats tonight. And they come from, we'll talk all about those things. Because I realize that I tend to know a lot of information, but I don't necessarily translate it. And so we do Esbats in the Church of Witchcraft monthly. We usually have the full moon and the dark moon. Sometimes it's the new moon. It kind of depends on how the day lands or what phase change is going on at that point in time. That being said, they are a crucial component. So essentially, Esbats are celebration. It's the very basic form of that. It can mean a lot of things. You'll see in some Wiccan traditions, you'll hear that Esbats are basically whenever the coven gathers together. Oftentimes covens, and this is a conflation, and that conflation comes from the covens meeting on a full moon or new moon or some sort of lunar phase of some kind. Therefore, a lot of the Wiccan gatherings, people think, oh, Wiccans only gather on those days. But realistically, you'll see a lot of different variations on a theme with the Esbats. And just suffice to say, it's a gathering time and it's a celebration of some kind for points of articulation so we understand what it is we're even talking about. And again, this is also a kind or type of ritual. And we will circle back to that as well, because there's also some other articulation I've talked about in the past about rituals, spells, ceremonies. But Esbats specifically are a type of ritualized behavior. For witchcraft purposes, lunar phases do a variety of different things, but they are there to recognize or ritualize lunar phases. That's what the Esbat is for. So you're recognizing what state the moon is in and what phase it's going through and all of those pieces. And it ritualizes, and ritualizing for purposes of this conversation are principally just your behavior, basically the behavior around what you do on that specific day. It's a cue that we have. And as stated before, it's a staple ritual that's within TCW. And it's been one of our strongest gathering times. And I know that many of you can actually attest to that we have, you know, anywhere between 15 and 20 people or so at most of the Esbats. And that includes Esbats that are in Denver as well, closer to Westminster. So we have two locations that we have, you know, services that are going on. Primarily, we're in Colorado Springs for the Church of Witchcraft. But we also have another branch that's up in Denver, nearest to Westminster. And so we always encourage people to attend those if they can. And this will sort of clarify why those Esbats are important and why what their function is within our organization. And really, they are a multi-purpose sort of event. So Esbats have this multiple purpose to them, and they can satisfy and fulfill a lot of things. And you don't necessarily need to have a group for this. You can do this solo on your own. You know, it comes in a lot of different forms, just like any of our behaviors. So with the Esbats, there are primary phases. As we know, the moon waxes and wanes, and if you don't know that, then you might want to do some 6th grade research or 3rd grade research. I'm not really sure, but there are plenty of guides and information out there on what phases of the moon are and how they wax and wane and all of that stuff. I'm not going to the astrophysics side. That's not celestial witchcraft, and it's not well beyond the scope of this conversation. So phases that are the most prominent for Esbats, specifically within the Church of Witchcraft, there are various cultures that have differences in opinions on what lunar phases you're working with. For example, in China, they have an autumn full moon, but it's not every single full moon. And they don't consider that an Esbat, obviously, because it's more of a Euro-Western kind of concept anyways. But there are rituals that are across the globe in multiple different cultures that celebrate them in different ways. So those primary phases that we at least recognize, and mostly the Wiccans will also have, and many witches will recognize these two, that you have the full moon, big, obvious one, right? It's the big circle thing that's white in the sky. It happens usually once a month, sometimes twice on a blue moon. The second one is a new moon phase. And then the third is the dark moon phase. The full moon of that itself is at full illumination, 100% at its maximum peak. You can find a whole bunch of apps that explain this or will alert you to them. And this is really your heightened potency. So each one of these has a function. And in a full moon, you have a heightened potency, or there's more power to your magic, essentially. The witchcraft that you're doing is going to have an increase or boost from that space. As witches, we weave within the liminal and we work within liminal spaces. And that being said, we're drawing power from the moon. Yes, this also does mean I was talking about drawing down the moon, and that is a ritual that we will talk about. This also can heighten at full moons extrasensory perception. So that would be claircognizance, clairvoyance, clairsentience, all of that stuff. All the clairs are in there, and they have an attunement to them. It is also a time for us to weave magic. With these phases, this is one model. There's a lot of ways you can take this. You can move them around. You don't have to recognize all of them. It's really up to the individual or the coven or whatever group is ritualizing this practice. Some may only celebrate one specific phase, e.g. the full moon is most common. And I put these mostly in order of least to most common, the most common being the full moon. The new moon is pretty common, and you'll see that fairly frequently. But it gets kind of difficult trying to meet twice a month with the same coven repeatedly, just for scheduling reasons purely. But the new moon is your first sign of illumination. So after it's waned all the way down to dark, the first sliver of light when the moon comes back is the new moon. This phase usually lasts about 2 or 3 days. And with the new moon, your intention setting, that you are developing ideas or you're putting together new things. You're thinking about the long lines of, say, tarot starting, you would be somewhere in the 2s, 3s, and 4s, starting the journey, starting to lay some foundations for that with that intention. The new moon also includes the waxing phase. And during waxing, it's the same thing. We don't know, I'm going to use simple terms here because we're at basics here. Waxing, adding stuff. It's getting brighter, basically. So you're getting more stuff on to the phase that it is. So in the waxing stage, it is about amplifying as well as intensifying. So during the phase, so once the new moon starts and then ongoing till the next major phase, there is a waxing, that is the waxing phase. And you can amplify things that you want to add to a spell or increase in a spell or whatever divination you might be working, that's the time for it. You want to get the window?
Oh, absolutely.
So amplifying and intensifying within that waxing state. A less common phase of the moon that people don't often recognize is the dark moon, and that is at 0% illumination. Big surprise. This should be pretty obvious here. The dark moon itself, that we have in the way that we recognize them, is for restoration, introspection, as well as removal. So these would be, and that is all of those things, any way that you can phrase that. So removal of relationships that might not be working, or ideas or constructs that aren't working for you, or banishings, or any of those things. And even not even the negative things, the positive things too. that there might be a removal or an ending of something. I find that the moon phases themselves help regulate, and that is part of where that phrase comes from. I'm not even going to try this, but basically the name comes from being regular and, cycling through. So with that, the dark moon also includes the waning state. So the waning state is the light is going away. And then is about that phase is specifically about endings. It can be about cleansings as well as reframing. So reframing whatever you're doing, whatever your intentions are, and getting ready and prepared for the next phase that's coming up. This is why we have these. And we have to sort of shape what these phases do to even know what we're going to do about a behavior about it. There's a lot of skills within witchcraft. You can look at plenty of the other sermons that we have. You can find books on these different skills, but they will align with these lunar phases. So to remind ourselves of, now we have these phases down. The spells, rituals, and ceremonies. Very basically, a spell is a series of instructions that you're using, or it's a series of verbal instructions or physical behaviors that you're doing to affect a certain change. Also, part of that, part of being a witch is manifesting with intent externally and internally. And spells are one of the ways that that vehicle is how that's realized. So when you're saying a spell, whenever you're writing down a spell, even if you're not vocalizing it, that's the word I use, vocalizing, even if you're not vocalizing, you're not using language or spoken words to say the spell, you're just thinking it. That still is part of it. And it's about that manifestation piece. The step up from there, and this is really in container for a reason. So the ritual part is about the sequence of behaviors that you're doing. And this specifically has a cue. As we're talking about Esbats, our cue would be whatever phase of the moon that you're working in. Full, new, dark, whether it's waxing or waning. And you can divvy these things up, and there's plenty of other phases that are within that. I'm just giving broad strokes for ease of access. So within a ritual, we have the cue, and that cue being, in this instance, Esbats, or those full moons, the new moons or the dark moons. And that gives us kind of information about what we want to do and what our spell focus might be. Within a ritual sequence of behaviors triggered by a cue, you may be doing spells, setting intentions, instructions, and doing certain behaviors in a tradition or in a consistent manner. Ceremonies are almost exactly like a ritual. A ceremony is everything that a ritual is, with a cue, a certain set of behaviors, but also includes a phase change. A phase change just means from one state to another state. A phase change could be something, it's usually larger. So we experience these all the time. A lot of people have ceremonies, and not just within witchcraft, but think about graduations, for example. A phase change from not graduated to graduated. A phase change from not being a father to being a father. A phase change from healing to, I don't know, producing more, I suppose. But all of those phase changes are part of what we do, and that's what a ceremony includes. So inside of a ceremony, you have rituals, and those rituals are the sets of behaviors that you're doing. And inside of that ritual, you are doing a certain set of instructions, the spells. Ceremony to ritual to a spell. This is important to know because if we are ritualizing a lunar phase, we need to know that we're doing a sequence of behaviors based on a certain cue, and we're going to produce a set of instructions, e.g. a spell, with which to then enact a change internally or externally. And these aren't just isolated things. And I tend to get in this trap myself, that I think of doing one spell or two spells or doing that and keeping it very limited. I think that just comes from out of necessity more than anything else, that I don't want to spread the focus too much, especially because I want to bring all of my attention to what I'm doing. And so I will focus on one spell specifically. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do multiple spells inside of a ritual Esbat. So now we have the construct of all of our phases that we're working with, the broad stroke phases, full, new, dark, waxing and waning, along with what ceremonies, rituals, and spells generally consist of. You will hear very commonly that during these Esbats or during these ritualizations that you will have raising, focusing or concentrating energy and or magic. Beyond the scope, again, energy versus magic, I'm going to use them interchangeably for the purposes of just ease of conversation and ease of presentation. But during an Esbat, when you're gathered, even if it's a group or solitary, you will be focused on raising, focusing, concentrating that energy or magic. And this is how we can ensure that we're supporting, as the Church of Witchcraft, we have the ability to support multimodality. A modality is just a type or form of witchcraft, a system or tradition specific to itself. Since it's just raw energy or raw magic, if you will, there's no dictation as to what that is. No one modality owns the moon or owns the magic of the moon. Yes, there is an amplifying factor. If you have a coven that's all worshipping the same way or doing witchcraft the same way, there is a cohesive intent that's happening, and there is an amplification within that. That's true. And so there is some dilution there. Regardless of that, we still think that it's really important for the church to offer this kind of raw magic, this access to it. And so the Esbat is for doing exactly that. So when we're all gathered together, for those who have either been to them or thinking about attending any of the Esbats that the church is holding in whatever city, or if you're doing it by yourself, the intent there is to create that raw magic, for you to work something. It's the raw material that you're going to be leveraging to enact witchcraft practices, basically. And within witchcraft, there's a whole bunch of things. But one of the things that witchcraft is specifically these acts, these supporting things, the development of that raw material, right? Witchcraft is also divination. It's also spellcraft. It's also community work. It's also, marriages. It's also all of those things that you think that it is. But it often isn't said plainly that it's also doing witchcraft is making that raw material available to perform something with. And as I said, the Church of Witchcraft, TCW, the staple is Esbats. It's a unifying factor that is able to draw magic for a common utility, and therefore it is also multi-purpose. We don't always do spells at that. We're not also telling people to do certain spells. We may do a group spell that we invite people to join, but that's not always the case. There's a flexibility to Esbats and how that format looks. The Wiccan religion will have a specific way to do it. The chaos witches may do it a certain way. Green witches may do it a different way. There's a lot of ability to manipulate and morph whatever the Esbat is for your needs, because you're just making that raw magic available for utility. So witchcraft, when we're doing Esbats or functioning, or when we're offering these Esbats, what we're doing is often spells and or divination. Spell type of divination, maybe. But divination more specifically has to do with trying to discern information from a supernatural source, essentially. You're looking at something that's extra physical, something metaphysical, maybe from a deity, it could be from nature, it could be from a lot of different sources. But that divination is trying to discern messages or find messages and meanings within patterns, basically. So divination is inclusive of tarot. It has to do with pendulum work. It is rune casting. It's a variety of different things. And spells, like I said, are I'm going to use the other really long concept of this, but a neuro-linguistic program that you're using. So you're neuro-linguistically programming your subconscious with a spell. And not just your subconscious or the self, the first altar, you're also programming that which is around us. You're programming in whatever that raw material is, you're basically giving it a set of instructions to do stuff with. And so when we're running the Esbats, the spells and divination are going to be part and parcel of the Esbats themselves. And that is part of that ritualized behavior. We see a sequence of behaviors with a cue, and then we're going, okay, we're going to guide this towards spell or guide this towards divination. And that's a clerical decision. So the clergy are basically determining that because we're running the Esbats on behalf of the community. And so we offer them and we try and mix and match these things so that there's a lot of different access, a lot of different ways to see what an Esbat can do. And this is sort of how we got to this point, that I realized that we never explained this in plain language why we're doing the Esbats. We just said we're doing them and just assumed people would know, yeah, we're worshiping the moon. But really, are we worshiping the moon? What is it that we're actually doing? And part of it might be worship of the moon or a lunar deity of some kind. But it's also these other pieces. Therefore, this plain language is here. Another thing I find that is often overlooked is the support of others. And that's not just, so there tends to be sort of an egoistic sort of influence within witchcraft. And I could go on for a long time about that. But that egotism is not necessarily negative. It just happens to be that we tend to get siloed or really locked into our own particular thing. We might be solitary. Some people, we may not have a coven around us. We might not have other practicing people. And so we just kind of get siloed and funneled into this one kind of portion. And then we focus on the self more than anything else. But I want there to be an expansion. I intend there to be an expansion. There is within the Church of Witchcraft that we've been seeing, and it's very encouraging, seeing the community really come to itself and find the way to support each other. You're not drawing down the moon for just making raw material or making raw magic available, not just for your own potency and efficacy, but you're also doing that for those who are around you that are participating. So if you're in a group setting, it's not just you, there's more than that. And furthermore, that also goes for solitary practitioners. Sure, you may be doing an Esbat or performing an Esbat of your own accord by yourself, but it might be for your community. It might be for your city or your house or your family. They may not be practicing, but that doesn't necessarily exclude them or exclude, the idea that you can support them from this raw material of magic. So supporting others is an important aspect that I think doesn't get mentioned a lot about what are you going to do with witchcraft? Okay, so you do witchcraft, you do spells, you see manifestation, you see this consistently. Awesome for you. And then what are you going to do with it? How are you going to support your community with that? What do you want to do with that? And maybe you do just want to be alone and you just want to do it for yourself. That's also good too. But it's also important to consider how you might be influencing the community or how you could. And another really simplified version of that is also that you're developing and maintaining a consistent practice. That's a big piece. When I started with witchcraft, doing rituals, I was a solitary practitioner. I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I vaguely know what I'm doing now. I have a pretty large pool of knowledge and I have a lot of people that I can draw from other witches and other religious, leaders and that sort of thing. But when I started, I was doing these things and I would just forget moon phases. I was like, oh, it's the full moon. I missed it. And I would just do it on an errant random day. And I'm sure most of you probably have this experience. You're like, I missed it, right? But this consistency, the church offers the Esbats in an effort to encourage that consistency for that practice so you don't feel disconnected from that. There's an establishment of this parallel working, this partnership that witches have with liminal states. The less you traverse it, the less effective it's going to be. The more you traverse it, the easier it's going to be. The more access you're going to have, the more potency and efficacy you're going to experience because you're doing more of it. But at what point do we have? Where do we go for that kind of consistency? Do you try to make your own coven? That could be tricky. Do you try and do it yourself? Well, you forget things, you can set alarms, and you can do that. And I did that, and I got there. But I do find, where I really approached my own inconsistency. And we're going to have waxing and waning states of our witchcraft too. Sometimes you're going to be more active, and other times you're going to be more passive. And that's normal. So don't discount that. If you don't feel like you're ready to practice and you're not like, I'm not ready for a full moon, just don't do it. That's okay. The important point to that is recognizing that it is happening and at least being consistent in the recognition of that. And to that point, actually, you can see right here. This is a moon phase clock, and you can get these. There's a few companies that make them. I don't remember what this one is, but I can put it in the links down below. But the moon phase clock helps keep me more regular. I don't need it as much now because the church exists and they tend to keep me pretty consistent because we have, accountability to the laity to make sure that they're able to be consistent and have that framework. But that did help. And another one that helped was when I was working with just the coven and the church didn't exist. The coven, one of the things I wanted to do is that I did a multi-moon spell. Sounds super fancy. Basically, every full moon for 13 straight full moons, I did the same exact spell and the same exact ritualized pattern for 13 full moons. That was a lot of work. And that actually reminds me, I think that was actually my lesser working, now that I'm thinking about it. I think that's what it was. It's a coven thing, but beside the point, but coven that I'm part of, not all covens will have this, but I decided to perform the same spell ritualized for 13 straight full moons for prosperity and growth. And frankly, it worked. As far as I can tell. I mean, I didn't really do much to market the coven at all or try and get like the word out there. People just showed up, and now there's like 15 people hanging out in the coven pretty consistently. So that feedback is also really helpful to see what your spells have an effect on, and it's not likely to come in the way that you think it will. And this goes back into eyes of the witch, heart of a witch, hands of a witch, and that's also in our sermons too, and explains some of that those observational principles to know when the spell works. I digress. The developing and maintaining your consistent practice is really important, and that is the function of what's part of the function of what Esbats are for and why the church offers them. The functionality of an Esbat, of a phase, of a moon phase, basically. The 3 C's, again, there's most of the stuff, if you don't know what it is, it's in a sermon somewhere or it's accessible some other way. And you can also email us at any point in time for more information. But the functionality of the 3 C's, cleanse, consecrate, and charge. Not necessarily in that order, but the 3 C's are something you can do with celestial light. Also, don't discount that solar and lunar is a thing. So solar, meaning that you can use, solar is a celestial light. So is starlight. So are meteors. Those are celestial light, and that can also be leveraged in a pinch or with specificity, right? So if there's a certain meteor or it means a certain thing, or there's a certain star that you want to work with, like Aldebaran, you could use those lights to cleanse, consecrate, and charge. To cleanse something is basically to make it ready to accept instruction, basically. So let's just use the easy construct of a crystal. A crystal is inert, basically, and a cleansing brings it back to that inert or base state. And from that cleanse, then you can consecrate. Consecrate just means make sacred, make special. Pretty simple. And you do that through basically setting your intention. That's part of the spell work of just saying, I'm going to make sure that this thing is sacred. And bless this thing or enchant or charm, however you want to do that, depending on what it is. And then to charge it is then to bring in, so it's basically drawing down the moon, but into a specific object. Drawing down the moon also is generally a thing for high priestess. We'll get into that in a minute. But that charging can be done a lot of ways. Celestial light is not the only way. It can be done with running water, it can be done with fire. Just think of the elements and you can charge it that way. Odd ones that you probably won't run into very often is a charging through burial. That's one that people often overlook, but water and celestial light, fire are all pretty common that I see. Other functionality pieces of what an Esbat can do is to replenish and maintain your first altar. So as I've been practicing, what I notice is that waxing and waning of my own self, and we reference this as the first altar. The first altar is just the altar itself. That first altar goes through periods of, active and passive activity and passivity. And so whenever I'm doing things like this week, from the 18th to the 21st is just hell-mel nonsense. It's just crazy. We had an early solstice for Litha celebration, and then I have today for this sermon, and then tomorrow I have solstice proper. And I'll give you a reminder of that in a minute, but that's a lot of work. Just energetically, it's a lot of work to maintain those kinds of things and output that kind of energy or magic. And so you need to replenish those things. I found that for me, replenishing those is really important. And when my witchcraft stops working or doesn't work in the expected ways or the known ways that I understand, often it's because I'm out of it. I'm just depleted. I just don't have it. And so I use crystals, for example, to charge those up and use them kind of like a battery almost, or an amplification. So a whole other sermon that we could talk about. So I need to replenish those. And one of the ways that I do that is through the Esbats, through lunar charging, that kind of thing. But it also comes from that community aspect. So that group aspect, I'm also obtaining things from that. And also vice versa. It's not just one way, right? If it is one way, there's a whole other problem, and that is a social dynamic that needs to be rectified because that's not healthy. So reciprocation is super important. And so to maintain that first altar, if I'm not in a depleted state, just maintaining it, that consistent practice, the awareness, the respect, the veneration, whatever you want to call that, is also part of maintaining my practice so that it's consistent, so that road remains open. So that conduit is easier to access. I also want to revel. You can revel in the metaphysical or magical during an Esbat. So reveling in that is basically just enjoy your time with that. You don't necessarily have to do anything with it. It may just be to concentrate it. It may just be to be consistent. That could be all it is. It doesn't need to be more complex than that. You can also set your intentions and base that on your lunar phases. So setting intentions, what I mean by that more specifically is that the moon obviously goes through different astrological signs, Cancer, Leo, Sagittarius, Libra, all of those guys, right? And each one of those has an influence on how it interacts with the lunar phases. And those lunar phases are going to be, because of that interaction, where the moon, what house the moon is in, may affect family or business or death or health. And it may have a certain sign with it. So this can get pretty complicated, but basically, if you are celebrating a lunar phase of some kind, you might want to consider an astrologic, where it's passing through and in what house. If you're starting on witchcraft, or if you're just coming to this, just run with one of the phases of the moon and then expand up from there. It's part of building those habits. It was cue, routine, and reward are the 3 steps of making a habit. Your cue is whatever needs to happen or what's telling you to do a thing. Your routine is what you do from that, and then whatever you get out of it, right? So with your cue, routine, reward, the intention there is that if you're just starting in witchcraft, that it's important to set something that's attainable. If you're like, I'm going to do everything, I'm going to do full moon, new moon, dark moon, waxing, waning, it's too many things. Just don't start there. That's too many things, you're going to burn out. And that's not because like you're going to burn out from magic, maybe, but you're just going to burn out energetically. Trying to remember all of those and schedule all of them and make time for it. Start simple. Pick one of the phases. Full is probably the easiest. And then just run with that. It's pretty obvious when it's going to happen. You can see it. You can probably feel it. And you do get more attuned with the lunar phases. And you start detecting when they happen. For male witches, it's a little trickier. We don't have an inbuilt clock that tells us. For female witches, or they're going to biologically female. Let me specify that. Biologically female witches, they have an inbuilt clock, and that is way easier, and it is a lot more of a lift for biologically male witches to remember. So I had to put in all those other like reminders of clocks and calendars and that sort of thing, so I would remember that the moon was happening in a thing.
Bummer.
I know, right? Small benefits, take them where you can get them. So again, you can start simple with that full moon phase and then move up from there and then start incorporating little by little more and more. If you're more of a long-term practitioner and you've been doing Esbats for a while, either solitary or in a group, maybe start looking at what house it's in, what sign it might be in, things that might be interacting with it, the transits within the the Placidus system. So basically interactions between the other planets, Venus, Mercury, Mars, so on and so forth, and how they're interacting or interfacing with the moon. And this is where I'm saying you're basing your intentions on that. And that's where what I'm doing with Celestial Witchcraft is I'm focused on that. So I took a much bigger chunk and I did things that were more complicated or complex in operation. And it's yielded really useful results, and you learn more. And this is the development of your witchcraft praxis. Your orthodoxy and orthopraxy is that. That's part of witchcraft. The maintenance piece of your first altar or the self is about maintaining your potency and efficacy. So potency is, I really try to stay away from the word power because it sets up weird power. It sets up strange dynamics. I'm not trying to get more power. It's not my personal idea is not for witchcraft is not seeking power. I'm not there. My intention is to be more potent and efficacious. So the potency is how big of a lift I can make, right? And efficacy is how effective that was. Because you can lift a boulder for no purpose and then just drop it. And that wasn't really, it was very potent, but not really efficacious. It didn't really have an effect. Similarly with witchcraft, I want to make sure that I'm being potent, that I can make that lift. And if you can't, that is one way, or if you don't feel like you're in an energetic state to do that, that's when you start working with adding in like elements, planets, deities to assist you in that potency, basically. As I've practiced, the potency has increased at my base state, and I haven't needed to include deities, elements, and other additional things to assist my potency. Sometimes I do, and it depends on what I'm doing. If it's something I'm very unfamiliar with, I generally will look for assistance, metaphysically speaking. So I might reach out to a deity, I might reach out to an entity of some kind, because it's something I'm unfamiliar with. Healing stuff is not my bag. So I'm probably going to, since it's something unfamiliar, I'm not as potent or practiced within that. So I'm going to ask for more assistance. The efficacy really comes down to how effective was what I was trying to do. So if I can lift the boulder really well and I can put it somewhere, it was effective. If I'm doing potent witchcraft and I'm doing a certain spell or I'm doing divination of some kind, I'm getting useful messages, that's the efficacy of that. How useful are those images? If you're doing divination like scrying and all you're getting is images of like office furniture, it's not really effective. It's not really telling you much of anything. It's not enough information. And so increasing your efficacy is important in that aspect. And that's what the Esbats can be there for, is increasing that potency and efficacy. Through your consistent practice, through practicing witchcraft consistently, that's where that potency and efficacy comes from. And that's that waning and waxing that we experience in witchcraft as well. Your potency and efficacy will wane. And that's because of depletion, like I was talking about, or sometimes experience. It can be from doing too many things. It can be really just basic. You could just be tired. You didn't sleep well. Your work sucks. School's a bummer. Whatever it is, that can also be part of the whole package, because it's the first altar. It's your health in a holistic sense. And this comes to that diminishment and restoration. So through time, I sometimes get diminished depending on what I'm doing. And then I want to restore. And that's what Esbats are for. The lunar phases are for that. So in a diminishment phase, do you think that would make sense to try and add things into yourself during a waning phase if you're feeling diminished? Probably not, right? You would be looking to replenish yourself during a waxing phase where you're gaining things, where the moon is rising in strength, potency, efficacy, that kind of thing. Make sure these things match and are congruent, or they're keeping in mind those aspects. And you can think of the correspondences all day long and do that of your own accord. And then also, like I mentioned, replenishing others is a huge piece to that I'm finding is important. As the church has been gathering for the last several years, people are noticing that their potency and efficacy have increased. And that isn't necessarily even in person. I would prefer in person, but in a pinch, do what you can, right? Work with the materials you have. But what they're noticing is that their dreams are more effective. Their spells are more obvious to them. They're not as tired when they're doing divination or spell work. And so there's a benefit to this. And even if I'm in a strong state, or if I'm in that, robust place where I don't feel diminished, that's the clergy's duty. That's not just our duty, but it's also our honor to be able to do that, be that space that we are able to give of that, because we have enough of our own stores to be able to give out to those witches that may be disenfranchised, or they may be disconnected, or they may be experiencing a disconnect in their practice. And that is also something to do. And it's not just on the clergy, but it's also on all of the other people to do that. Even if you're solitary, if you're just doing, if you're in a strong, robust state of your own witchcraft and it feels, you feel healthy there, and your first altar is all together and harmonized, maybe you just do an errant spell for all witches and add to the community and say, take of my energy. I'm able to give of this magic to others. I have a profundity. I have a big fountain available for this magic to give to others. And think about doing that instead of just taking. Think about also that transmitting. So receiving and transmitting are important, but I think that we often focus too frequently on receiving instead of also transmitting. So what to expect? What is the Esbats? What are the Esbats like with the Church of Witchcraft? What to expect? You're going to see a congregation of witches. So a whole bunch of witches are going to get together in a room in some location, in a park, whatever. So there's going to be a lot of people there. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to interact with all of them. We have plenty of people, and sometimes we have neurospicy, I think is what.
Neurospicy.
Yeah, neurospicy. The neurospicy people from Mel. I'm not sure if I can read that. That might be a you think, Gwen. I know, right? We're going to read this message real quick.
Clergy appreciation post. I really like how you break these definitions down.
You are very welcome. Neurospicy was the, yeah, that's not a me term. I use
Neurodivergent.
neurodivergent and neurotypical. But neurospicy, there's a lot of that in paganism, just in general. And there's definitely a lot of it in witchcraft. A lot of different reasons why. But that neurospiciness can sometimes mean that you're out of spoons and you don't have enough spoons energy. You don't have enough energy to do things or to engage. In our Esbats, that's fine. You can just let the clergy members know and just be like, hey, I am out of spoons. I do not have the social batteries to deal with this. And that's cool. You do not have to interact with us. We can just be like, okay, and we'll hold that space for you so you can still partake of the group, but not necessarily have to be forced to be social and interactive, because that happens. Not all of us are ready to interact or engage, or it feels awkward or whatever. So again, congregation of witches, especially if you get 20, 30 witches together, it can get a little wild. Just there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of magic going on. There's a lot of people doing very different things. And that can be really daunting and overwhelming. And the clergy's job partly is to rein that in and to make that accessible and less wild and uncontained. I'm actually not sure, because I do this pretty unconsciously, but I'm wondering what would happen if we intentionally like remove that limiter instead and just feel like, yeah, we're not going to guard any of that. We're just going to let this go rampant and just see what nonsense happens.
I mean, I think a lot of crazy stuff would happen.
Right. Anyways, that's a different experiment. But congregation, bunch of people. Or be my eye. But multiple witches are going to be there. You're going to see the clergy members there. A deacon is probably going to be running that, or a cardinal, or somebody is going to be running that and guiding us through that. There is a representation of multiple modalities. So you might have green witches, you might have death witches, you might have whatever. There's a whole variety of different terms, then take your pick. But there's going to be a lot of different forms going on. It's usually, like I said, led by clergy members. In a pinch, if we have to, there may be laity that runs these, but that really comes down to not having enough people. And that is going to be group dependent, individual independent. Roughly 2 hours. Sometimes they expand. We've been trying to keep that more on the rails because it can get off the rails pretty quick. If we're just together, we like to do witchcraft, we're talking about stuff, and then it's suddenly 7 hours later. And that's not helpful for anybody. It needs to be a lot more focused just for everybody's well-being and consistency. So roughly 2 hours, you might see 3. We usually keep it within that window. Variations in lunar phase and astrological placements. So like the full moon in Pisces, for example. And that's just one of many examples, but those variations in lunar phase will be dependent. So if we can just run with this a little bit. So with a dark moon, for example, where you're talking more about that restoration, the introspection, if the dark moon happens to be in Cancer, then in that state, it's going to be more about emotions, about divination, about your connection to self, connection to others, and those kinds of things. And out of respect, the dark moon Esbat will be shaped according to those principles, essentially those correspondences. Inclusion of ritualized behaviors. So you'll see invocation, devocation, depending on what clergy member is running it, because they're also not the same one, because there's no central dogma, there's no central practice. There's a flexible narrative, basically, that loosely binds us together as a coherent group. But the type of witchcraft that's being done is going to be really dependent on the clergy member. And so the onus is on the synod, basically to make sure that the clergy members have some idea of what it is that they're doing so that they can translate this to others and be coherent for the laity, basically. But they may invoke elements, it might be deities, they might be working with just goddess green man, they could be working with any variety of different aspects within that invocation and devocation. Circle casting is another thing that you'll see pretty commonly. Common narrative that you'll see often is because of the proliferation of Wiccan materials, super great, but casting circles doesn't just exist within Wicca. There is also a lot of other people that use circles for sacred reasons. Mesopotamia is one example. They use chalk for an example of agricultural sacred circles. Beside the point, circle casting might happen, and with that circle casting, you might see calling of the quarters, so the cardinal directions. You might see that being called in. It really depends on the clergy member that's running it. For me, I use a veil, and that is the celestial veil. I'm not going to go way into detail with this, but it's a different form. It's still about making a sacred space. I'm just not using a circle, different reasons. And then, like I said, calling in elements or calling in elements by the cardinal directions is a quarter call. You might hear it called watchtowers. You might hear it called guardians. A lot of different terms might be used for that. So those are some of the things that you will end up seeing at the kind of what they're going to be shaped like, what those Esbats might look like, and what to kind of expect. In Wiccan practice, I see a lot of times where you have a group of people that are then, and this is drawing down the moon component as well, and this is about that replenishment piece too. The high priest, high priestess will be in the center of the circle that they're casting. Members will be around them, and they'll be drawing down the lunar deity or lunar goddess into the high priestess, and the high priestess will then provide guidance. You start getting to some interesting territory here. We start talking about this has some overshadowing of shamanism, of seance, of possession, of channeling, those kinds of things. But drawing down the moon is drawing down that lunar deity or that magic for the individual within the high priestess, then disseminating that to the members that are present. We haven't done a drawing down lunar ritual in ourselves. It's just not one thing that we do because we're not Wiccan. I don't exclude that practice, but it is one manner of working with drawing down. Some of the activities that you'll see at Esbats, specifically Church of Witchcraft Esbats, and most of them, you'll see things like spells being cast. You might see them being drafted or written or enacted. Divination is another thing that might happen. You might want to think about if there's a specific deity or god that you work with, god or goddess. You might see veneration, so the honoring of a deity. You might see fealty. I'm paying fealty, we're paying respects to. Supplication is giving of yourself to that deity. Community bonding is another thing as well, or just connection. And that community bonding is really, we're all witches, we're all doing the things, we're all here together to celebrate the lunar stuff, we're making this raw magic available, and we're doing this in conjunction together. So that is part of the community bonding and connection. And that consistency is really important. That soulful aspect has meaning and purpose. And it's not just, we're going to do witchcraft and goodbye, we're never going to see you again, and we're never going to think about you again, right? There's this buy-in to your social networks. And also replenishing the self, others, or both. So replenishing yourself from that pool of raw magic, the replenishment of others if you're in a robust place, or it might be both of those things. You may be giving and taking, receiving and transmitting in the same ritual itself. With the cleansing and consecrating, what you will sometimes see is what I have on the rest of this. This is actually from I'm actually going to make a good point here, that this is Aries lunar water, and I made over a decade ago. Let's just put it that way, a while ago. I have very little of this left, but there's a lot of conversation about how long you can keep your lunar water or celestial water for. Way beyond the conversation, but this is one of those things. You might see people filling glass jars like this, which is currently empty. They may fill those with water, and they'll have those blessed or consecrated, so the 3 C's during an Esbat as well. This was another one, and this is what I fixed in my practice since then. This is part of that learning. This was full moon Scorpio moon water, lunar water specifically, from May 5th. So now I know when it was done, so I know what it's going to be used for. And this often takes, celestial water can be used in a lot of different things for various operations within your witchcraft, whatever that is, not just celestial witchcraft, but it can be used to bless and consecrate tools. It can be involved in rituals and ceremonies. That has a lot of different purposes. So creating celestial water is also something that you will often see within the Esbats. And you'll see that not just at Church of Witchcraft stuff, you'll see that in a lot of different approaches, systems, and traditions too. Not everybody has a focus on the moon, obviously. There are lunar cults that exist in history. There are solar cults that exist in history, Christianity, but there is a lot of different ways to celebrate this, and maybe that's not your thing. There may be other things you may worship or focus on, but in terms of Church of Witchcraft, Esbats, that's really what our focus is, what the functionality is, what they even are, and what you're going to see at them, and what things can be accomplished with them. If you're solitary, the same things can be done, and I encourage those, and build those habits in the best way you know how. And don't take on too much, because you don't want to get into that kind of depleted state, because for me at least, it's very difficult to move away from that state. And that can just wreak havoc on my divination and my ESP stuff and all of that. And that in turn affects everybody else that's also connected to me and the communities that I'm part of. So it's an important aspect to me to maintain my first altar as well. And it looks like, and that is the end of what I have to say. I also can't see that, but I do know we have a hand raised.
Yeah, that just says hand raised.
Let's take that hand raised up there. I can't read. Is that Jeffrey?
Yeah, this is Johnny.
Johnny, thanks.
When you this is great stuff. Trying to learn as a guy. I wrote down the 3 C's. Was it cleanse, consecrate, and charge?
Yes.
I was wondering about the water. Do you store your jars of water in different locations, like for different purposes, or how do you do that?
So storing them, I tend to keep them in a cool, dark location, primarily. I don't really care to put them in sunlight or direct sunlight for just complications, is my thought. I don't really know why I do that. It's just an instinctual thing. One of the strongest skills that I have is claircognizance. I just know things, and I tend to be pretty accurate. And so my instinct is to keep lunar water out of direct sunlight as much as I can. It's not always feasible, and it's not always reasonable. Like we were doing this, the solstice on the 18th. I had lunar water with me. We're in a park. It's bright. There's no way I'm going to put like duct tape on these things, and like I'm just not going to do it. Like it's just going to happen. But for purposes of storing, I do try to keep it out of direct sunlight. And then I don't necessarily have specific locations, but I could see making a box or a shelf or something with markings or sigils or other purpose designed things to keep them. Kind of like shelf stabilizing food. It'd be like shelf stabilizing celestial water, basically.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. Any other questions or comments even? I'm always interested in people's feedback.
Or concerns.
Yeah, I don't know what concerns you would have, but maybe.
I have a question.
Sure. And what was your name?
Asher. Can we get a list of the separate Esbats? I kind of arrived late, so I might have missed it, but
Are you talking about what phases of the moon, or are you talking about specific names of the moon itself?
Esbats are the celebration of the moon, yeah? And then there's the Sabbats, who's the celebration of the sun.
Right. Esbats, this is where it gets kind of tricky. So Esbats are a common term, and it hails from a different source. I don't have the name memorized, but basically it's about cycle, essentially. Esbats are loosely termed a celebration. They've entered into our narrative. I don't see Esbat really I don't see that term until somewhere around the 19th century. I haven't seen it elsewhere. They usually just call them ceremonies or rituals in other anthropological sources. So I don't see that term often, but Esbats are basically a celebration. Most often in Wicca, they're considered lunar celebrations. For the Church of Witchcraft, we also consider it as a lunar specific ritual. But if it's just celebration, or if it's just cycle, then technically I would say, or even just theoretically, I would think that solar stuff would also be within that aspect too. I'm just not as familiar. There's not much written on it that at least I found, if that answers kind of your question.
That does it. Thanks.
Yeah. And also to explain, to give you another why I asked name of witch, because you have the names of the moon phases, right? So we have most commonly full, new, dark, and within those waxing and waning. And there's, gibbous and so on and so forth that, finer grain stuff that is beyond our needs, really. But beyond that, different cultures have different names for the moons themselves. So like buck moon, hare moon, rose moon, strawberry moon, all of those so there are multiple names for different months of those full moons. So that's why I was asking, because there are different names for each one of those. I will tend to stay away from first indigenous peoples of America's names for those out of respect, because I'm not part of their tradition. And I just want to be aware of not overtaking something and not paying the due fealty or respect to their culture, because I don't follow that. And so it's not mine to utilize in that way. So I tend to just default to full, new, dark, waxing, waning, and just call it good. And I may look at some of the other stuff, and I may do some of the historical stuff and say, this is what this culture has said about this moon, and this is why they named it that way. But for my practice, I don't tend to incorporate those names. If it's appropriate for you, go for it. But for me, I wanted to make sure that I was aware and cognizant of the respect of that culture. And since I don't know enough, I don't want to lay claim to it or include it in my practice. Things that really helped start giving me a narrative for this: moon magic. This one was really helpful. It's an easy one. You can get a hold of this. It's literally everywhere. I would recommend Abe books. Alibris, Alibris. Those are two online sites basically. And those are just discounted sites. So you might be able to find this used if money is a concern. You might be able to find this in bookstores too.
Libraries, possibly.
Yeah, and this one was by Diane Alquist, Moon Magic. And this was pretty thorough, and it was one of the very few books that I found that actually talked about lunar male deities, which is an oddity. It does exist. It's not as common, but this was one of the few books that actually referenced a male version of lunar magic, which was unusual enough for me to pick it up. Another one that you can pick up, this one's a little bit older, so you might have a little bit more difficulty. This is Lady of the Night. And this was Edain, Edain McCoy. And this one really broke down a lot of the lunar stuff really solidly. It's going to lean a little more Wiccan because of it being from Llewellyn and just their practice themselves. But this was a good starting point to work with. And if you want deeper information for that, and a lot more of a history lesson, just read this book. It doesn't even matter if it's about Esbats. This talks a huge, there's many versions to get the most recent version you can, but Drawing Down the Moon does talk about the neo-pagan rituals and Wicca and how they draw down the moon and why it matters and where it came from. And there's a whole bunch of useful information in this too. It's a good staple. I wouldn't say it's authoritative, but it's very comprehensive. And I like comprehensive because I like seeing the alternatives to things and to broaden my horizons and understand better. I have not found things that interest me particularly, not necessarily the church, but my interest lies in a lot of the Akkadian, Sumer, Babylonian Ur, that sort of thing, because that specific area then on the planet in history had a lot to do with celestial magics. And that is relatively odd in terms of what I've seen across history. They tend to be a very large source for some of that information. Some of the things that I've written without reading any of their rituals, some of what I've written down accidentally aligns and is mimics or is really close to those rituals without ever having read them. That's the weird claircognizance that I tend to experience. Yes, Ember. You've got a book reference, don't you?
Well, actually, the one that you were talking about by Adaine McCoy, it's been retitled The Witch's Moon.
What? Well, whatever. I think it's more appropriate and it's more inclusive, let's be fair. But yes.
So if you're looking for that one, it may be listed as Lady of the Moon or Lady of the Night or The Witch's Moon. And it even says it in here, previously titled.
Oh, that's great. That's actually really helpful. Yeah.
And then also, I was going to say, this one's a newer book from Barnes & Noble, as you can tell with the red sticker up in their cheap section. They have a lot of witchcraft-oriented books there now, so there might be something there. Yeah. And I have a billion other books probably for the moon, but...
Nice. Well, with that, I'm going to go and turn off our recording.